Firstly, I just want to say thank you again to everyone for being here. Um, my name's Michael Brady. If you've been at a Perspectiva event at any time in the last year, you may have seen me before. And I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend, longtime friend, Phap Linh, who's a senior Dharma teacher in the Plum Village Zen Tradition. Um, which is the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. And what can I say about Phap Linh? Phap Linh, I first met Phap Linh, I think it was 2010 when I went to Plum Village for a retreat for the first time. Um, and I can share, I'd been reading a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh's books and really falling in love with this path of practice. And I was very excited to go to Plum Village. Um, and when I got to Plum Village, uh, saw Thich Nhat Hanh, and that was wonderful. But one of the things that surprised me, that really struck me, was the kind of way of being of the monastics there, and they seemed very happy and very relaxed. And I thought, oh, I want to have some of that, you know. And somebody that really embodied that for me was Phap Linh, and so he's been a good friend to me for many years. And he's a wonderful Dharma teacher at Plum Village and gives wonderful talks um, on Buddhism, but also integrates a lot of uh, wisdom and fields of knowledge that are also outside of Buddhism. So philosophy and science. Many of you here are fans of Ian McGilchrist, and Phap Linh is also a fan of Ian McGilchrist and has been in conversation with him. I think he came to Plum Village or beamed in for a neuroscience retreat during COVID when it was online retreats. But Phap Linh is also a wonderful composer and cellist, and was a composer um, before he became a monk. So I'm really excited to talk with Phap Linh and yeah, engage in this dialogue. So welcome, Phap Linh, to this space.
Well, thank you, Michael, for such a generous introduction. It's wonderful
Yeah.
to be here with everyone.
So I thought what would be nice to start, I want to get into a conversation. And if you haven't been at one of these events, usually what we do is we have a conversation for about an hour and then we'll open up to Q&A. What I'd like to do today is actually start a little bit differently. Um, and I'm very grateful that Phap Linh's given me permission for this before we started. So what I'd like to do is we're going to start with a little short practice that Phap Linh will guide us in, just a few minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, um, just to bring us into a kind of a quality of awareness and attention. And then I'm going to play a piece of music that Phap Linh, I think, did you write this or was this a translation of a Plum Village chant? I think the piece with you on piano and cello.
Yeah, no, it's I wrote it.
Okay, nice.
Yes, so thank you everyone for being here, and yeah, this is a piece of music which is an instrumental version of a chant which is actually in French. So it's based on a text which was originally in classical Chinese, which my teacher translated into vernacular Vietnamese, and then was then translated into English and then into French. And every time it was translated, my teacher, Thai just means teacher in Vietnamese, that's Thich Nhat Hanh, he wanted it to be set to music. And the thing he told me, he always said this in relation to music and in any kind of cultural expression, he said, use local materials, which I took to mean, find a musical language and style which is, rooted here somehow, whatever that means. So I didn't really know what that meant, but I kind of went. I suppose I went digging in a feeling of Celtic roots, because I'm kind of Welsh, French, English, some mishmash of all of the above, and yeah, there's just a feeling of rootedness in with a familiarity with those roots somehow, a feeling of home. So I felt like maybe that style or that kind of musical language would connect. And so we have a chant for it in French, and this was the melody that I composed. And then right at the beginning of the pandemic, I actually was in lockdown, and sort of at a loose ends, I just thought, well, why don't I transcribe it? Make an instrumental version. I wrote a piano accompaniment, and then I recorded myself playing the piano part, and then added the cello part on top, just because it was just a way for me to connect with people in the world, and just to feel like I could offer something, maybe a little moment of solace for people who were going through really tough times, as I think many, many were at the time. So let's just take a moment to kind of see if we can cultivate a deeper kind of presence, a deeper kind of listening. We know that the presence is something which is of a variable nature. We can be more or less present. And there are ways that we can establish our presence. So for me, one of the ways that I like to employ, that I learned from my teacher, is to bring my awareness to my body, to my sensations in the body. So we can start just noticing whatever position our feet happen to be in, however those sensations are. We don't have to sit in any special way, but just noticing the feet feel like that. The legs feel like that. The buttocks feel like that. The back, the shoulders, the arms, the hands, the head, face, eyes, and forehead, and ears, and nose, and cheeks, and mouth, and tongue. Just bringing all of these sensations, which are always there, but just bringing them back into the sphere of our awareness. And what that does is that then grounds us and connects us to the present moment, because all of those sensations are only ever in the present. And so as long as we are with those sensations, the feeling of weight, maybe as tiny little micro movements and changing of the balance and the curvature of our spine as we breathe. You can even feel the air on our skin, even if it's barely moving, even if we're indoors. You can feel the tiny, tiny little movements and currents of air, because our skin is so sensitive. And these are all the sensations that we might otherwise just overlook or disregard because they're slight. But when we bring our attention to them, they can grow. And we may realize, oh, even if there's a little bit of tension, there might be a little bit of pain somewhere in the body, but overall, perhaps it can be quite pleasant just to be in those sensations. Now we can just notice the breath coming in, the movement of the in-breath, the movement of the out-breath. And we're just coming deeper and deeper, as though we could sort of sink ourselves into ourselves, sink ourselves deeper into our own sensations, into our own weight, and just sit ourselves deeper and deeper, arriving more and more in this moment, in these sensations. And I suggest as we turn on the music, maybe just allow yourself to just keep the little thread of awareness of the breath coming in and coming out.
Mm. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, brother. Feel I need a little bit of time. Oh, you're muted. Can you hear now? Can you speak? Ah, there we go. Go.
Mm.
Yeah, I feel I need a little time to launch into a conversation after that. It was really beautiful.
It's quite something to listen together in presence. And I think it's weirdly rare, you know,
Mm.
that we allow ourselves to do that. We see that in Plum Village. Plum Village is a monastery where I live in the south of France, and we have big summer retreats. Maybe like 1,000 people show up for 4 weeks in the summer, and a lot of children, maybe like 150 kids running around. And one of the practices that we have is walking meditation, where everyone walks in silence and presence, quite slowly, just aware of every step. So they're basically doing what we were just doing, sitting, being aware of our feet, being aware of our body, but you're doing it in motion. So you're just bringing your attention back again and again to the present, to the sensation of your feet touching the ground, and so on, the legs moving, the whole body moving, the environment around you, the other people, yourself, your feelings, your thoughts, everything in the present, to cultivating that precious but sort of underappreciated resource of presence. You could call it mindfulness.
Mm.
And then, so Tai, our teacher, this was one of his favorite inventions. And I wasn't planning to talk about it, but it just seems to fit so perfectly with the topic of this conversation. Once a week, we would walk down the hill from Upper Hamlet to another part of the monastery with a little courtyard. And if we were lucky enough, there would be some musicians. I'm a cellist, so we have a sister, a wonderful violinist. And then sometimes there were some other professional musicians who would come. And so sometimes we could pull together a string quartet. And we would be there under the trees, waiting for 1,000 people to appear, walking very slowly and silently, who would then surround us like this vast, silent ocean. It's quite something, 1,000 people in silence, and sitting down, and we would start playing Mozart and Bach and Schubert, and people would have this transcendent experience. Sometimes listening to music they were very familiar with, but they'd never really listened to before in that way, because the field of presence is a collective phenomenon as well. So when you have 1,000 people all generating that awareness and presence, suddenly the music lives and breathes in a completely different way, and people will be crying. And so yeah, I feel like that's one of the great joys of my life, that I get to offer music in that kind of setting when people are very deeply present.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and as you say, this is something that seems to be more and more rare
Mm.
in our in the modern world. Um, I think
Yeah.
the kind of initial impetus for this series of conversations was the the shorthand we were throwing around at Perspectiva was music in the meta crisis, right? Which is music and the state of the world, and I think one thing that seems, I mean, the meta crisis has so many aspects to it. Um, it's like I think of it somewhat like an entangled kind of karmic knot that we seem to
Mm.
not be able to really disentangle ourselves from. This complex system that kind of hardens and the knot gets tighter each time. But if there's one thread in that, it would seem that it's our habits of attention and the way that we dispose our attention and the way culture and society um, and technology increasingly and the economy pulls us in towards habits of attention that are the exact opposite of what you describe,
Mm.
you know? Um, so yeah, we've jumped right into the
Jump
heart of
right
this, and
in.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it is
To the
it's
heart of it.
beautiful. And
Mm.
part of this this inquiry is how can we make those kind of qualities of togetherness, maybe communitas could be a word, those kind of
Mm.
experiences come more alive because they seem to be the lifeblood of the soul and something that's deeply necessary for us, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about concerts. I used to go to concerts. I was at a music school in Edinburgh when I was from age 11, and they had this wonderful idea, which is to offer us season tickets to the I guess it was the what was it called, the Scottish National Orchestra, probably, I think, something like that, and they would play in the big hall there. I can't remember what it's called, Waverley Hall or some kind of hall, and so every Saturday night or Thursday night or whatever night, we would go there, and there'd be some grand production, big orchestral symphonic concert, and our aged 13, yeah, Usher Hall, there you go, RSNO, yeah, thank you, somebody's on the ball. And so aged sort of 14, 15, we thought it was very clever to stand on the steps and sell our tickets and go off and do something else, being very diligent music students that we were. But it's because actually the whole experience often was so stultifying. You'd go in there and you'd get a lot of very well-dressed people who are probably sleeping, like I'd say at least 50% asleep. The other 50%, I mean, they didn't have mobile phones, so at least they weren't looking at screens, but they were kind of discreetly trying to read the program, and also just maybe daydreaming. And this is not a judgment. Like, it's actually quite hard to pay attention. Like, it's something that you have to learn how to do. It's how you have to, and I found it myself. I'd be there, and then my mind would wander, and I'd be like, I'm not even listening to this. So, and then you start thinking about the players, and then as a classical musician, you know that sometimes you can play, and your mind is also wandering. You might not even be there. So if nobody's there, it's like the players aren't there, the audience isn't there. So what's happening?
Yeah.
So the whole question for me is how to be there. Everyone, from the players, even the composer, to the sort of setup of the space, the listening, the presence, and then I think that's when the magic happens, when you're there, and sometimes it just happens by accident, sort of by a kind of grace. Often with an orchestra, I would go to concerts in London, and just every so often you get a conductor who isn't using authority, but is using love. And you feel it, like the whole orchestra is just like, we love you, you're amazing. Like, and so they will do anything for that conductor. And then it's electric. Everybody's there. Everybody's fully present. I remember listening.
When you say the conductor is using love, Phap Linh, are you talking about, how is that expressing itself? Like, is that a love and a care for the musicians? Is that a love for the music? Are they kind of in a flow and a symbiosis with the music? I can have a sense of how an authority and a conductor might use fear,
Yes,
and to control the musicians, and how that would be very destructive. But say a bit more about how a conductor uses love,
well, they're
or
quite
is in
rare.
love. Yeah.
They're quite rare because I think my sense of it is quite hard as a conductor. You're put in this position, and the expectation, I mean, the whole culture is a little bit driven towards authority. This is your interpretation. You're going to take control of the orchestra. They're your instrument to play with. And, so it can be it's a culture also that feeds the ego, that builds up the persona. It's quite male dominated. It's quite there's a lot of power plays in that, but every so often you get lucky and somebody has just transcended all of that and is there kind of just for the right reasons. From a love for the music, from a kind of something transcendent, something spiritual, but maybe they wouldn't even say it like that. Maybe it's not consciously thought of as being a spiritual thing, but it is a spiritual thing for me. And just like when there's respect and generosity and kindness, in the rehearsals, in the way of treating each other. And suddenly you get into this positive dynamic.
Mm.
A lot of my classical musician friends actually find themselves much happier being session musicians, uh, for pop artists, because they can often, it's not always the case, but often they find it's just they just treat you much better. Everyone's kinder. There's less pressure. And classical music can be a very violent, emotionally abusive world.
Mm.
Anyway, kind of going off on a tangent there, but
Well, I'm curious. I mean, yeah, I mean, it maybe can bring us back because where I wanted to start was you were obviously a composer before you were a monk. And for most people, being a composer as a profession, well, for some people, could be like a dream life. Like you get paid to create art. Why would you give that up to become a monk? Right. So that's my question. That's my question to you. Why
that's a
did
good
you?
one. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
why did you become a monk? And especially, did you feel it? Did you feel with that you were um leaving music behind, or was that a fear for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I see it as being fundamentally because of a kind of very deep stubbornness in me. I didn't really I wouldn't have put it like this at the time, but now looking back, I realized that I can trace this stubbornness back to when I was a child. And there was just a complete refusal in me to participate in certain kinds of music. So when I felt like it's just for the sake of showing off, technical, facility, kind of, musical bravura,
Yeah.
totally uninterested. Just, I don't care. I just like, no, sorry, it just leaves me completely cold. When people started talking to me, and this is like a hothouse kind of music school where you're supposed to go off and become a soloist, and they start talking about the music industry. I was probably 13 when I first heard that term, and I was just like, no, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about, but that has nothing to do with whatever it is that I'm going to do, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I'm just not going to do that. So this just total refusal to participate in this kind of sausage factory thing of you're going to get technically brilliant, you're going to pass all the things, you're going to win the competitions, you're going to do the stuff, and you're going to compete, you're going to be the best. No, I don't care. I'm not interested. That's not what I'm doing. I don't really know what I am doing, but I just know that it's not that. And so when I actually got to sort of university age, I think another aspect of that refusal was actually I turned away from music. I said I just don't want to do it in the way that it's being offered to me, because there was a pathway. It was probably like chamber music or something like that. There was definitely a pathway. But I just didn't like it. It was too competitive. It was too mean. It was too. I didn't feel the love. I didn't feel the care, and what I would now call spirituality. I wouldn't have called it that then, and I wouldn't have known how to characterize what I was looking for. But I knew its absence. I didn't know what it was in a positive sense. I just knew the lack, and I wasn't interested. So then I switched. I studied mathematics, which maybe seems like an odd choice, but I felt like I was trying to find out what's at the root of it all. I know that seems a bit arrogant, but it's kind of like there's something important going on, something important and mysterious, and I want to understand it. And I feel like maths has something to do with that. It's very deeply enmeshed in the nature of things, time, space, and consciousness. So I want to try to understand it. But then I go to Cambridge and find it's dry as dust, completely, no room for creativity. It's again quite like, yeah, just kind of ended up sticking in my craw, as it were.
Like a similar kind of competitive,
Yeah,
kind of hard, kind of egoic driven space.
Yeah, and again, and at some point, just another sausage factory, and now for the city. So all of the best mathematicians of my generation ended up being quants in hedge funds.
Mm,
Like literally, many of my friends who were just absolutely incredible mathematicians, instead of being drawn into a love of ideas and research, they end up just being pulled into the city.
mm,
And so I felt like, again, there's something wrong. So I graduated. I was going to then come back and do the master's thing or whatever, to preparing for a PhD. But again, I had this moment of revulsion. I just don't want to engage. I just don't feel like that's the kind of thing I want to do. So then went back to music, and I more or less just in the summer just sort of started calling my friends and saying, I'm a composer, which I plainly wasn't. I just thought maybe if I just say so, then they'll ask me to write stuff, and I'll kind of have to be a composer because then I'll have things to write. So that's kind of what happened, and I had just a lot of wonderful, generous friends, and they played my my early messes, and they I gradually figured stuff out. I had some lessons and just did a lot of listening, and then gradually got to the point where I could make a living, and I was having bigger commissions and things that getting to write for really wonderful musicians. And again, I had this moment of just kind of no, I don't want it. I don't want to do that. And I'll use them. So I watched a film with my father a while ago, which some of you may have seen. It's quite a dark, difficult film. What's it called? It's Kate Blanchett as a conductor. It's just the name of the conductor. It's like a three-letter tar. That's it. And I think it's a very, very scarily accurate portrayal of what the culture of celebrity in music can do to somebody when you feed their ego, because they are brilliant and they have something, and you then praise them and praise them and praise them, and you reify this personhood, this self, to the point where it becomes practically demonic. It's like really toxic. And then there's abuse, and that people do terrible things, and they just behave really badly, and often are told everything's condoned. Maybe now in the age of Me Too it's changing, but I think for a long time, I think it's part of our culture almost that the genius is permitted almost anything in terms of behavior. They're kind of outside the normal expectations of morality. And it's like, as long as the music's good, you can be a monster. Doesn't matter. You can treat people badly, but as long as you produce a work of genius, then it's all fine. All is forgiven.
yeah.
You have to be like that. You're a twisted, tortured genius, and maybe you have to be that difficult a person, that unpleasant a person, but it's all worth it because look, a great symphony.
Yeah.
And I just felt like I wasn't anywhere near that level, but I just felt the beginning of that. And it was around me and it was in me. I felt like I was being encouraged to compete, first of all. I was being told that I was the one writing the music. And that might seem like, well, of course you were the one writing the music. But from my point of view as a meditator, it was very clear to me in the present moment experience of putting notes on the page, that there was no me doing anything, right? There was a whole system of clouds, trees, earth, ancestors, something mysterious, and music would come, and I'd be like, well, I'll just try to get it down there without messing it up. But I never felt like I wrote this. I always felt like, no, I'm the one who put my kind of grubby paw prints on it, and I distorted it, and I hope like something survived the process, but I didn't write it. you know? That's how I
Yeah.
felt. I would say things like that to people, and they'd look at me like I was an idiot. They'd be like, or they'd ask me to write, those program blurbs, and you'd have to say what your inspiration was for the music, and I'd always write things like, "Oh, I didn't write this," you know. and then everybody that would get edited out, and they say, "But what do you mean? Nobody understands, and don't be so, you're just being annoying now." And it was just so inconvenient because the whole world was set up to praise me for being the one who did this thing. And then people come up to you after the concert and they say, "Oh, you wrote this, and there's part of you that kind of goes, yeah, maybe I did. Tell me once more, okay? Yeah, yeah. Actually, I did. Yeah. I did write. Hmm. And part of you likes it. You're kind of like, yeah. Tell me once more. And
But you were already getting a kind of an allergy, like you were having some
yeah.
kind of awareness in yourself that
Oh,
no, I don't want to go in this direction. And
it's
this is quite young in your kind of like Dharma life, so to speak.
yeah.
But you're already get that awareness.
Well, I was very lucky that I went to Plum Village the first time when I was 19. So I was at Cambridge. I was still doing the maths thing, and it kind of got me through Cambridge. And I went to Plum Village at least a couple of times a year. And so by the time I started becoming, getting into that, I was doing bigger concerts, and as a composer, I was 25-ish, 26, and so by then I was doing longer retreats in Plum Village. I was meditating quite regularly. And so it was really like an important part of my life, my daily lived experience. And so thanks to that, really thanks to that, I had the capacity to compare two kinds of happiness, I suppose. So one was the happiness of being praised or being acclaimed or being recognized or being, just sort of like, yeah, great. People, it was like one particular moment, which I think I've talked about before, maybe with you, is the moment of just taking a bow at the end of a concert. So it's a big concert. I've been working on this piece for a long time. The audience loved it. It's like a standing ovation. You go up, you take your bow, and it's a thrill for sure. It's a rush. But it was very interesting because I'd just come from Plum Village for this concert. And so the sensitivity was quite high. So I could taste like, oh, I'm enjoying this, but I already want more. I could already feel it's a rush, but it's already not enough. And I know it's not going to last very long, probably about 5 seconds. And I'm going to want another hit. Somebody's going to have to tell me again why it was so great. And at the same time, I could compare with my inner experience of sitting meditation, primarily sitting meditation for me, where I knew I could basically have fulfillment, well-being, freedom for nothing, for free, without needing anything or anyone, not dependent on anything.
Mm.
And it's so different. And I could feel like here is a well-being that does me no harm, and in fact is just a kind of balm to my soul. And here is a kind of thing that is called happiness, but it's actually just a poison.
Mm.
It's a drug.
Mm. There's an interesting fact, Lynn, just to step back a little bit, what I hear in your story is from an outside perspective, music seems like a wonderful thing, and the more of it, the more that we have of it, the better for our society. But what you describe about the kind of culture of classical music and the culture that's within classical music education, and how toxic some of that can be. And then also you talk about this movement towards studying math, which springs from something that's very beautiful, that just this natural human desire to understand life, to understand reality, to get closer. And then you find something again that's then you experience revulsion towards the culture of that. And then you find yourself in this a little bit more free space where you're your own composer, but then there's still this as you described, this kind of toxin of of celebrity, of acclaim, all that kind of stuff.
Well, especially the reification of a self, of
Yeah,
like, this is a person who did this thing. That in
yeah,
itself
yeah, yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
toxic because it's not true. It's not.
yeah, yeah. It makes me what I'm reflecting upon is if we're interested in how to respond to the various challenges of our times and how we kind of um try to amplify the good parts of our culture, the stuff that's already good, that we have to be aware that even all these attempts can be co-opted by all of these other kind of streams of human collective consciousness towards acclaim, towards egoism, towards all of this kind of stuff, you know?
I think,
Um,
yeah, I mean, that's capitalism's major skill set in a sense. It's appropriation,
yeah,
appropriation, decontextualization, commodification,
yeah,
decentralization. It's brilliant. Does it
yeah.
very well, very effective.
And so can you tell us a little bit about your um conscious that there might be many people who've never been to Plum Village, who don't know Plum Village, who doesn't know anything about that. So could you say a little bit about life at Plum Village and your life at Plum Village and what it's like and what the practice is and what the orientation is and yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
We can dive a little bit more into the music after that.
sure.
Yeah.
Um, so Plum Village is a monastery. It's a Zen Buddhist monastery in the Vietnamese Zen tradition, founded by my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. When he was exiled from Vietnam, he was eventually given French nationality, and he was able to establish himself there. And initially, it was just set up as more or less like a refugee camp because it was in the middle of the boat people crisis, and France was at that time being quite generous in receiving Vietnamese refugees. But then they were kind of rootless, and so my teacher wanted to create a place where they could, where their kids could learn Vietnamese, where they could learn Vietnamese songs and dances and just be connected to their roots and their culture, as well as Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism. And but it was so magnetic that Westerners started arriving, and people just sort of started begging my teacher to teach and to ordain them as monastics. And eventually, he sort of relented. He refused for a long time, and then eventually he said, "Okay," and he started ordaining people as monastics. And then he had a kind of vision for, well, maybe this society does actually need monasticism. Maybe monasticism can play a role in healing some of the brokenness. I mean, it's important, I think, to put it in the context of the war in Vietnam, which there is not called the Vietnam War; it's called the American War for obvious reasons. So I think my teacher's peace activism was directed at trying to understand what is the root cause of this war, of this violence. And so when he came to the West and he went to visit the Pope and he went to visit Robert McNamara and Martin Luther King and many other people, and was trying to understand the consciousness. Why was America engaged in this war? What was the root of this violence? And so all of his peace activism also operates on a very long time scale. So people were a little bit confused when he founded Plum Village and thought, oh, is Thai no longer doing engaged Buddhism? But no, like this Plum Village, the monastery, founding a monastery in the West, is Thai's peace activism, because he's saying you need more people like this who are trained not to react in a situation of conflict, who are trained not to take sides, who can help people to reconcile and get over their anger and their hatred, who can get over the anger and the hatred in their own hearts, who can heal their own sort of deep-rooted ancestral legacies of suffering. And so it's kind of like aimed at maybe preventing a war, not that war, which maybe he couldn't prevent, but he could maybe stop a war in 50 years' time. And who knows? It's like, maybe it seems like not enough, but that's the direction. And so we receive people from all over the world, maybe like in Plum Village itself in France, I think it's about 15,000 people a year to who want to. They usually come and do a week of retreat of meditation, and so it's still a refugee camp. You know, we're receiving the refugees from the meta crisis, and just like surrounding them with love and care for a week and looking after them, and then we send them out hopefully a little bit more resilient, a little bit more loving, also able to offer and radiate that love around them, very much like what you're doing. So that's the idea. It's like train the trainers kind of model. So we train the carers, the therapists, the teachers, the doctors, the nurses, and then hopefully that sort of ripples out. And I think it does ripple out. So that's what Plum Village is about. And in terms of music, the reason that I could ordain there was that music was always a big part of life in Plum Village, and art in general. So all kinds of art. So my teacher always said Zen and art always go together. You know, many great Zen masters have been calligraphers or poets. And so there was no kind of dislocation. You know, it's not a separate thing. It's actually going deeper into the thing that I really want to do, which is music, but in a particular way. So having said that, it still wasn't easy, because I knew to some extent, and even maybe to a great extent, I would have to give it up. Right. So I'd have to give it up at the professional level that I was accustomed to, like working with the highest, you know, the greatest musicians, young musicians of our era, and just that very intense, high level kind of, I mean, that there was a very joyous aspect to that, which I had to renounce. And so it's kind of like, okay, so now I'm doing music, but it's with an out of tune guitar, with, you know, one string missing, and 100 people who've never been trained to sing and don't know how to read music. So here we go, you know. So I had to like give up a lot of expectations or ideas about what music even is, and a lot of my kind of preciousness around certain aspects of music. But I also, and also just in the monastic training, there's a kind of, like a big part of it is just becoming a beginner again, like humbling yourself, becoming the one who doesn't know rather than the one who knows or thinks he knows lots of things. So maybe right at the beginning, there's a kind of like, it's better actually if I don't play. I don't want to immediately be seen as somebody who's very capable at something or has a talent, because then that makes me, you know, again, I'm still back in this whole ego game. So I have to kind of just be really simple for as long as I can, and just, you know, cook, clean, wash up, sweep, do everything, all the normal monastery stuff. And hopefully that can start to transform some of the bad habits that I was accumulating otherwise.
Yeah, it's interesting what that point about Ty said about Zen and art being, you know, not separate. It seems like in our culture in the West, you're probably familiar with the book Consilience by E.O. Wilson, about the kind of jumping together of knowledge, and he had this idea, just for those of you who don't know, that there's going to be a kind of a knitting together, a coming together of different streams of knowledge. Whereas for most of maybe the last 500 years or so, the West has kind of fractionated out the knowledge and specialize. And it seems that we've done that as well, not just with our endeavors in knowledge in the university, but also with culture more generally. You know, so you have religion here, and then you have art here, and then you have commerce and forms of economic activity here, and it's all kind of split up. In Plum Village, what's interesting is the art and the spiritual practice are much more woven together, as mutually supportive and affording of each other, which is quite alien to, I think, in for us in the West.
Yes, I mean there has been a kind of secularization of music, obviously, and in a way, importantly so, like a separation of music from a kind of um, uh, from dogma.
Mm.
So maybe there was a good thing happening there, but there's also a great loss, which is the professionalization. You then go in the direction of the professionalization of music, and this culture of celebrity and genius and so on. So there's kind of pluses and minuses. I mean, when I say that something is lost, what I'm thinking of in particular is the kind of anonymity that was afforded to maybe the monks who wrote the great Gregorian chants. Almost nobody knows their names, you
Mhm.
know, and it didn't matter. It was just the purity of that offering to God, and the lifting up of the spirit in that act of music was so far removed from kind of, personality and uh, yeah, the cult of celebrity. There's something very protected because as a monastic, you're not dependent on earning an income, becoming famous, having a reputation, having a following. I'm talking now in the modern age. There's something very privileged actually about what you can do as a monastic, because you don't have to make a living, and you don't have to be famous. You don't have to succeed. You don't really have to. You don't have to engage in the whole capitalist enterprise.
Mm.
Um, Not to say that some monastics do, but you don't have to. And
Mm.
so that's what I'm really fascinated by this possibility, um, of doing something like music. And it's not just music; it can extend to many different domains. But for me, it's primarily music. To be able to come together as a group of people to say, "Hey, let's make a piece of music. Let's even record an album," for example, as we've recently done, and we're going to do it not to make money. Um, we're not going to do it to get famous. We're not going to do it to be popular, or to be liked. We're going to do it for love. We're going to do it because we believe that a certain kind of music made in a certain kind of way can help. You know, it can just help people to feel better. It can be a very real offering into difficult spaces, into difficult lives, and it can be of real meaningful support to people.
Mm.
And when there's that purity of intention, I don't know, for me that's very, very special. Now of course you can do that, and I think many great artists do that. They are in service, but it's much more difficult
Mm.
when you're not a monastic, because you do then have to pay the bills, and you do have to make a living, and you do have to get a following, and so there's always going to be a pressure sort of pushing you in that direction, and you have to be very strong actually to sort of retain your real reason why, like why you want to do it, what's the point of it all. And so then for us as a monastic community now, in a sort of more engaged sense, what we want to do is to start offering retreats for artists to support them in making art of all kinds, for maybe this, what I would call a deeper reason,
Mm.
and which is probably more resonant with their original intention, maybe even as a child, that wish to sing, to create, to celebrate, to paint, to dance, to write, whatever. It's very, very pure, and I think it needs a lot of protection.
So, and in a way, with the monastic life, there are all these conditions that you see that support the monastic being able to do creative work, artistic work in perhaps as you say, a deeper, purer way. And it sounds like what you're describing is we need to find ways to create um conditions for those who are not monastics, but
Yes.
still have that same desire to be supported, to be kind of anchored to that deeper, purer, the kind of, to use the term, the mindfulness sati means remembering, to remember that their deeper aspiration rather than, yeah, it being caught by the, again, to use Buddhist, caught by the marketplace.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's enough just to be reminded, or just to be in a community of people who kind of agree that, yeah, this is the more important thing.
Yeah.
And it's what I've seen in artists is that there's a kind of uh, a um, a release of a very deeply held tension when they feel safe to make art in that way again. They're kind of like, it's a relief. It's a profound relief. Just like, oh, wow, okay, I can do that. I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Yes, you are. It's like the joy of the amateur musician. Like, amateur musicians have a huge advantage because they can do it amateur, for love.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
meaning of the word.
Yeah.
That's what all music should be.
Yeah. 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 So Fab, then I wanted to, I'm conscious of our time, and I really wanted to explore a topic with you that uh we exchanged some tweets about. I think about a year ago. I actually looked up in advance of a conversation, and it's to do with I think we're in a time where many people care deeply about the world, you know, and they have deep respect for the various wisdom traditions of the world: Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and but many people may struggle with the ontological claims, you know. Um, but they still want to be in some way devoted.
Mhm.
And I use that term quite precisely. So I think people want to live the life of devotion, but it's maybe not in the it's a devotion to maybe life itself, to what feels beautiful, to what feels meaningful to them.
Mhm.
Um, these a lot of times these people are described as spiritual but not religious, and I want to in one of this tweet and it caught my eye from you because you said something about what we need is this ontological openness, and it strikes me that Zen is I think all of the world's wisdom traditions have this kind of quality of them when you get into the mysticism and the
Or yes.
yeah. But Zen seems to be particularly um well developed as a kind of almost explicitly being like, yeah, we see when you think you've grasped the final truth, you know, take that
That's
hand, give
when,
yourself a slap and go
yeah,
back and sit again. And
exactly.
so I'm curious, like, what one, if you could say a little bit about what you mean by ontological openness, and then, and if you can, then after that, maybe you could say a little bit about how you practice a kind of, you're devoted to a path of practice when there's a deep epistemic humility about what is the nature of life and the nature of existence, and the nature of being. And when you don't really know, how do you continue to practice with devotion? So that's a long question, but
A good one. I like it. It's one that's close to my heart, and one that I've struggled with over the years because I went into the monastic life really quite confused in a sense. Like, I knew, like I said before, I knew the kinds of things I didn't want, and I knew that Plum Village was a place where maybe I wouldn't, I would be free from those aspects of, having to be competitive, individualistic, and so on. And maybe I would even be trained to release those habits of, being competitive and individualistic in myself. That's still work in progress. At the same time, I was very confused about the role and the status of religion for me. I was and perhaps still am quite anti-religious in quite important ways, which is a bit odd to say as a monastic of 16 years. But I think that's at the heart of your question. So it was quite meaningful for me, and also confusing when Tai, my teacher, as part of becoming a monk in Plum Village, you get a name, and your teacher gives you a name, which is sort of the result of their insight into you and into your being, and the particularity of you. So I, in the at the end of the ceremony, I get this name, and he says Brother Phap Linh, and I don't understand because it's in Vietnamese, and then he translates it, and he says in English, true Dharmic spirituality. So Dharma is the path, that's the way, that's the teaching, and all the monks get true Dharmic something, or true something of the Dharma, true Dharma something. It's always true and Dharma, and then the last part is the bit that's specific. So for me, it's spirituality, which was a very interesting name to receive. And I received it almost physically. I really felt it as like a, I don't know how to say it. It was like a structure, like a three-dimensional something, like a waveform that just entered into my being and began to heal. I could feel it knitting together this deep wound that I didn't even know I had. Until the moment it started to heal, I didn't know that I had this gash in my being that I now see as being the corrosive action of scientific materialism, basically, of a kind of skeptical outlook, and the overuse and the over-reliance of rationality in a domain where it's not applicable, which is the realm of the mystery of the divine, of spirituality. So I was trying to assess spiritual truths with rational means, which are completely inappropriate to the task. But I didn't know that. So I was doing my best to skeptically and rationally decide, is there just matter, right? Just bits of stuff meaninglessly bouncing off each other, and kind of like just some giant universal clockwork, meaningless, pointless, soulless, indifferent. And we would be part of that. We would also be mechanisms within that view. This is a sort of, I mean, I'm sure this audience is very familiar with this from Ian McGilchrist's wonderful work. But for me, it was really the result of reading Richard Dawkins, aged 14, and at the time not being able to argue against it. So then taking it on, because I just, out of sort of an attempt at intellectual rigor and honesty, I was like, well, I don't have the means to disprove it. So I have to then apply it to myself and to my life. But that's a very, very painful thing to do. Age 14, I was telling myself, I am just a biological machine. I am a mechanism whose sole purpose, it doesn't even have a purpose. It just accidentally is structured in a way that seeks to maximize its chances of reproduction, right? And everything else is actually just a sort of higher level abstraction of that fundamental thing. So kindness, altruism, generosity, love, none of those things are real. They're all fake. They're fake in me. When I feel kind, I'm not being kind. I'm just trying to seek, sexual status, basically, in some very distantly abstracted way. That's what I told myself. And it's so brutal. It's so painful as a way to live, as a thing to believe that that's what we are. So there I am, and I get this name, and I suddenly realize, like, okay, this person that I trust possibly more than myself, Tai, is saying, A, spirituality is something real. B, you can somehow have something to do with it. You can live it, be it, manifest it, become it. Maybe you have to learn and live into it, but it's there as a potential in you. And his trust in giving me that name started this deep process of healing for me, which is ongoing. And so I'm trying to come back to your question, which was, just help me.
It was to do with
I'm in deep waters.
Ontological openness.
Yes,
And
yes.
there's
Okay,
that
got
kind
you.
of epistemic humility and still being devoted to a spiritual path
Right.
without that
So,
kind of conviction or certainty about how things are.
yeah. So
Uh,
this is and was still, well, it was more difficult for me then. But I was sort of coming, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to become a monastic, but I'm very, very skeptical and kind of not sure about this whole business, this whole religion thing. And I'm going to become religious, a religious person. Am I now Buddhist? What, what does it mean? I have to believe certain things. And I really had big problems with this. So I even asked my teacher, like, do I have to be a Buddhist to become a monk? And in typical Thai style, he just grinned. So I was like, okay, I'm good. I can do this. And I felt like my trust started to condense around certain things. Because of we have these 14 bodhisattva precepts. So the first of which is this fundamental kind of, what Thai would call it, the lion's roar, which is this commitment to openness. And a refusal of ideology or dogma in any form, even Buddhist ones. So when I read that, I was like, wow, okay, there is a religion, there is a spiritual practice which encodes at its heart and puts it in number one, of its principles, a refusal to be bound by or committed to any form of dogmatic belief or ideology. I was like, that is cool. That is ground that I can stand on, right? If that's the resting place, the kind of like, I refuse to be bound by any doctrine or ideology, then that's the kind of ground that I can stand on. So it's basically like built in this profound anti-dogmatic stance. And what that encodes is also an understanding of the limitations of language, because what it's saying is, we know that whatever we say in some profound sense is wrong, because it's the map, it's not the territory, right? Language is a beautiful, wonderful thing, but it's not reality, it's not experience. And so anything that we say about the nature of experience in language is by definition wrong. It's not, it's like this, somebody said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Right? So it doesn't mean that we can't use language, but we have to be very, very, very careful about what credence we put in it, how we handle it. It's an instrument, it's like a knife, it can cut you. If you use it skillfully, it's helpful. But if you don't know how to handle it, you're going to get in a big mess. And that for me is, I don't want to make any too sweeping statement, but for me, I think a lot of the harm that has been done by organized religion throughout our various variegated histories in very different cultures is around this, the thing that happens when language takes over and solidifies, and then we make demands on people. You say, no, you now have to believe this, and you have to agree with this creed. You have to you have to kind of certify, like, I believe in this. It's the thing that I had an allergy to in school, when they say, I believe in da 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 da, and you have to recite the creed, and I'd be like, but I don't. So why do I have to say it? This is madness. And it's not faithful to the roots of Christianity, even. It's something. It's a later accretion, I would say, but I mean, maybe I'm not so qualified to talk about that. But I think what I can have faith in is not a set of beliefs, but a set of practices. Okay? Because the practices are means that are offered to us to help us to disentangle ourselves from our hidden assumptions and views and beliefs. So they're basically heuristics. They're not treated as holy or absolute truths, right? They're treated as temporary, changeable, upgradable, work in progress. It's like, well, we found that by paying attention to your breath, something happens, which is that you start to, the mind can settle we can move from the verbal sort of narrating experience into a more direct felt sense, experience of life, and then we can move into the direct felt sense of the roiling world of emotions, and then we can move into the direct perception of the at the speed of thought in the present moment without being swept up in those thoughts, and then we can kind of observe the process and the arising of the subject and object of consciousness coming together in every moment. We can observe that directly, and that all starts by just like paying attention to your breath and your body. It is a method, it's a praxis, right? It's not a belief system. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But I can have faith in that. Why? Because I can verify it for myself.
Yeah.
I can do it, and I've done it thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and it continues to bear fruit. So that is something I can absolutely have faith in.
And the experience is the verification, the direct knowing.
Only
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I love is a practice and a community life, like you could call it, like John Vervaeke calls it, an ecology of practice. I really like that phrase.
Yeah.
Where you can start to see that every aspect of that community life is articulated, is sort of set up to facilitate that freedom from views, dogmas, and beliefs, and that constant reminder to come back and verify for yourself in kind of what I call the laboratory of your own present moment experience. You can do lots of experiments and you can test and see, like, is this true?
Yeah.
Does this work? Is it still true? Do I need to change it? Like, yeah, those experiments are very fun, and you can keep doing a lot.
And I'm conscious of our time, and I want to hand it over to the audience for questions. But I maybe throw one last question at you, Phap Linh, just to bring us to a close. Um, and also just to let people know why I've wandered into this area of metaphysics or ontology. Because one of the things that I'm curious about is
Kind of
there's
anti-ontology.
anti-ontology, yeah. There's the
Unontology.
yeah, unontology, that's a mouthful.
Mm.
There seems to be a kind of a need for cultural renewal, and affording opportunities for people to come together. One of the things that Greg Thomas and I spoke about last time was the African American musical heritage and the social rituals and practices that 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 really were life sustaining for that community for a century.
Yeah, I listened to the
Um,
conversation. It was really beautiful.
yeah, and so, but we're in this time where we don't have a kind of ontological consensus in our society. So the reason I'm curious is can we create these forms of communitas, and maybe music is one of the most powerful vehicles to do that in a way that is ontologically open, in a non-ontological way.
Yeah, I love that. The comment. Wow,
Yeah, no, I
somebody
saw that
nailed
there.
it.
That's great.
Nontology.
That's
I,
great.
I'm
Non-ontology. So yeah, I just want to
I'm
ask
gonna
you that
borrow that. I'll
question.
credit it. It's a
Do you
great
think
one.
we can do that? And
Fantastic.
and how do you think we might be able to do that? As someone who is kind of has so many experiences of communitas at Plum Village, could you see that moving into society in a more uh, without being tethered to
Mm,
an ancient 2000 or 2,500 year old wisdom tradition?
okay. So, yes, because that is what we're doing right now, in a sense. I think we're engaged in that business, and it's happening, I think, in lots of ways. Yes, also because I think there are ways to engage with these wisdom traditions that are safe, in a sense, from dogma, like I described. For me, I feel safe to engage, to be rooted in a tradition, because I think tradition, like, we can't dismiss tradition, right? We can't throw it out of the window.
100%,
Yeah,
100%, yeah.
we actually, I think right now, part of the danger is kind of spiritual window shopping, or another manifestation of that is just the capitalist appropriation of even something like mindfulness, and so you know, some of the most beautiful, sacred, you know, products of human culture are now getting commodified, productified, and sold back to us in almost unrecognizable form, where they are completely separated from the ethical roots, completely separate, and so we're in a very sticky situation. So what I propose is this kind of, there's this narrow path where we can receive the insights of tradition as praxis, not as dogma, or, you know, kind of a belief system. So what you have is a sort of like an unbelief system, or like a kind of like belief verification system, or like what I would say, like I've been thinking about this a lot recently. This is to do with a book that I'm working on, which is, so it's a one possible framing of Buddhism for me, because people have said, oh, maybe Buddhism is like science, or is, you know, science. No. I think, if anything, Buddhism is a set of skills or methods which involve also training and a teacher-student relationship, right? So it's not just you'd learn it in a book or from a YouTube video, that there is something mysterious that arises in community practice. There is something mysterious and deep that is beyond words, that is transmitted by a teacher to their disciple, right? So this is also a little bit antithetical to our Western sensibilities of, I'm just going to do it on my own, and don't tell me. And, you know, I'm kind of like, we're a little bit skeptical about teacher-student relationships because of the way that they've been abused, and how, you know, power dynamics have come into them. So there's, you know, it's not easy to navigate, but I do think it's possible to receive these traditions, to learn from them, as a way to take off the glasses that we're wearing without knowing, which are our views, our worldviews, right? It's like we have a view on the nature of reality, on the nature of ourself, on the nature of human beings, and what it all means. And then we get to have a practice that goes, oh, look at that. That's interesting. Here's a view. And then you can either, you know, you can give them you can clean the glasses, you can put them back on, or you can put on a different pair of glasses, you can change them, you can wear sunglasses, you know, it's like, or you can wear no glasses. Very hard, but possible. This, I have a point of disagreement with Ian McGilchrist on this one. So yeah, I think in that sense, it's possible to engage with tradition. As to your question about whether it's possible to create spaces of, I don't know exactly how you put it, but it's kind of like spaces of healing.
Communitas, I would say.
Communitas, yeah. And maybe music and celebration, without feeling that you have to now become a member of something, or you know, have a certain allegiance to any particular tradition. I would say in Plum Village, the vast majority of people who come to our retreats don't consider themselves Buddhist. They're never asked to convert to anything. They're never told that they have to now be Buddhist. In fact, what we generally do is encourage people to go to strengthen their roots in whatever tradition they come from, whether that's Christian, Muslim, Judaism, whatever it might be. We're like, there's beauty and depth in your roots, and you also have to take care of them. And if these practices can support you in that process, in freeing up and healing your own relationship with your own tradition, then that's our greatest happiness. So we never we're not interested in converting people, and I think we can create these spaces where practices are offered, and they're offered freely. Like, it's not kind of like, you now have to do this. It's like, well, if you've chosen to come to Plum Village, then presumably there's an intention to experiment with this. So there has to be a general willingness to have a go, but it's not very forceful or you know, authoritarian, as it were. It's just like, try it. If you like it, carry on, and apply it. You know, be inventive, be creative. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I think this is a good time to open to some questions from everyone. What I'm going to do is, then I'm going to remove the spotlights that are on us, and then hopefully we'll see everyone. Yeah, and then if you'd like to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand, if you can do that electronically, that would be best. So you can go to the reaction function, um, down in the bottom of the toolbar, and then click raise hand. And then, yeah, you should be able to ask a question. Uh,
See, there's lots of wonderful comments here that I haven't had a chance to read. What was the point of disagreement with Ian McGilchrist? Well, it's not really a disagreement. I think he said something slightly offhand about not believing that it's possible to have no view. So what the highest view, what's considered right view in sort of traditional Buddhist thinking, is sometimes referred to as the absence of views. And I think he may have taken that a little bit, not in the sense that it's intended. He said, well, it's not possible to not have a view. You always have a view because you're embodied, and so as a human being, yes, you are seeing from somewhere. But what I think, as I understand it, it's meant to mean the freedom from a set of metaphysical prejudices, basically, of any kind. And that's at the conscious level, but also at a very deep unconscious level. So it's basically also a freedom from language and a freedom of the kind of narration, from the narration of experience through the means of language, because language in itself encodes certain views about the nature of reality just because of the ways, the structures of grammar. For example, the verb to be implies that things either are or they are not, right? But that's a view about the nature of reality, which from a Buddhist point of view is very misleading and is actually at the root of a lot of suffering. Like if we think that things exist, then we reify them, we solidify them. So the freeing from views is this idea of like, if we could somehow get to the roots of how how language has conditioned perception, we can uproot that and get back to a kind of direct perception in which there is no reification and we're free. And that's what's considered the view of no views, of no view. But it doesn't mean that you still see the mountain, right? You still see the river, but you just don't reify it in the same way. So I think if we had a chance to talk about it more, I don't think we'd disagree at all. Is enlightenment direct perception from the right hemisphere? Maybe. I don't know. We don't talk about it much for obvious reasons. Why don't we talk about it? Because then we make mistakes. Because language.
Would anybody like to ask a question? And it's great to have questions coming in the chat, but it's also really nice to get people's voices in the space. So, Jonathan, I think Jonathan has a question.
There was a great question in there about spiritual narcissism.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for the really wonderful event and talk, and thanks for joining us and being here today. I guess I wanted to just query you on the spirit rather than the letter of what you said vis-a-vis your own history and your own sense that you could commit to something that was a kind of non-ontology, as the term was coined. And I guess I was just curious about how that works when one faces resistance or one faces struggle, because I think those who've studied spiritual practice and alternative spiritualities outside of religious contexts often find the problem arises precisely when you reach some kind of limit or obstacle, and you find that you're obliged to actually, seek out a teacher or seek out someone who's been there before And that's precisely what you get within a tradition. And the binding quality of that tradition is often something more, if not doctrine, then dharma. You know, at least there's some kind of shared commitment to something that isn't just a practice. And I wondered how you contend with the idea that, you know, try it, you might like it, or try it, it might work. How far that can take you, and whether it risks collapsing into a do what works for you and you only, and therefore ends up shoring up problems of narcissism and kind of spiritual materialism, rather than actually leading to something like transformation.
This is a great question, and it's thank you. It's one that's also close to my heart, because now, you know, as a slightly more senior monastic, I'm involved in monastic training. So I have to, you know, we receive young men in their 20s who have probably done quite a lot of spiritual window shopping, and who very much want to come and sort of try it, but without committing much to anything. And it's a huge problem, because so the subtlety for me is this, that when I say, you know, for example, I received this, there's a sutra called the Anapanasati Sutra. It's the 16 exercises of the full awareness of breathing. So there's this thing that the Buddha said, maybe the Buddha said, but anyway, it was recorded as the Buddha said this, which involves 16 exercises. They're very specific, they're very detailed. And the invitation is to try it, right? So obviously, then there's the question of the way, the how, which is a kind of hemisphere question as well, because I could try it in a kind of like a very uncommitted way. I could try it in a way that has no love in it. I could try it in a sort of selfish, narcissistic way. It's not going to work, right? So the try I'm talking about involves a kind of surrender already. There has to be some stance of spirituality, which often depends on the relationship with the teacher. So there has to be a relationship of trust. It can also be with a community where you see, like, I accept that I don't know, and that I may not be the best judge, actually, of what is reliable and what is unreliable, even to some extent in my own experience, because I may be so caught up in narcissistic fallacies that I don't even know what's happening in myself. So I need to trust that there are kind people around me who have enough insight and presence that they can kind of, maybe at the beginning, see into me a little more clearly than I can see into myself. And they will help me and they will guide me. And when they ask me to do something, when they invite me to do something, like, say, bring my attention to my breath, I have to be very, very attentive to not only the explicit instruction, but the implicit instruction, the way. Mm-hmm. So when they say it, there's obviously the sort of syntactic content of what they're saying, but there's also the tone of speech. Mm-hmm. There's the cadence of speech. There's their energy, whatever you want, you know, whatever that means. Their being, their vibration, somehow, they're also communicating to me a way of being with my breath, which can't be written down. And I have to surrender a lot of my hostility, you know, a lot of my reactivity, a lot of my arrogance, just to start to open up to the possibility of, I really don't know, and I'm ready to be taught. So that's the stance. It's like, I am trainable. I'm sufficiently open that I now I've kind of developed a little bit of aversion, you know, not aversion, but it's kind of skepticism about the reliability of my own assessment of things. And so I then take refuge in a teacher or in a community who has more experience on the path, and may then, and that depth of experience transcends lifetimes, because it's that teachers, and going back. So it's a very, very deep kind of experience that I'm talking about, which is then the sort of what is being transmitted. And then when I sit down on my cushion and I try to follow my breath, I may conclude after one session, oh, well, this doesn't really work, or this is not applicable to me, or my personal trauma is different. I need more of this, a little bit of that. And this is, we get this reaction all the time. You say, well, I know that's great, but, I need something more specific. I want to do my own thing. And we have to be quite firm. And what we say is, okay, so you say you tried, but I don't actually believe you. You need to try again and again and again. And there's the discipline element. You need to do it enough, and you need to do it kind of like honestly enough, and with enough of the right attitude, the sort of spiritual surrender to say, yeah, I have wholeheartedly engaged with this practice with a little bit of faith thrown in, right? But because for me, to sit there on the cushion and say, okay, so all I'm going to do is bring my attention to my in-breath and to my out-breath. And every time my mind wanders, I'm going to bring my attention back. And it's supposed to do something, but fundamentally, I don't know why. I don't know how. I don't know the mechanism. I can't understand the mechanism of why that would do anything. I have some theories, but they're basically useless. And if it doesn't work, it's probably because I didn't do it right. So it's kind of like I have to suspend my disbelief in my own ability to do it. I'm more like, well, if the Buddha said it works, and all of his disciples say it worked, and my teacher says it works, it probably does work. And I kind of have to step into the void. I have to take a leap of faith at some level. I have to actually, because it's part of the working of it, and it does work, is when I believe that it's going to work. So that's when it's a bit weird, and it can sound a little bit, and then you're, getting into some sticky territory for us very rational Westerners who've grown up on skepticism. So it is hard, but then faith is a necessary component, and discipline and rigor and kind of sort of community checks and balances, and spiritual narcissism is an absolute reality that we constantly have to be alert to.
Thank you.
I realize I'm muted there. Thanks for the question, Jonathan. Thanks for your response, Phap Linh. I think we're just coming to a time, but I see that Kelly's raised her hand. So if we can keep it short, Kelly, I think it'd be great if we could just get one more. Go for it.
Sure. Thanks so much for this inspiring conversation today. I'm a professional musician, and I am on the threshold of a transition where I'm feeling called to do music as an act of service. And I'm wondering if you have like an idea or something to be taken into consideration as I'm working with and collaborating with other artists to define what that can look like in the pedestrian sense. Like how do we set up the setting to create the conditions for the mindset to have this transcendent communal music?
Excellent. Beautiful. Excellent question. Thank you. A very practical one too. I have I would say some direct experience of this in a couple of different settings. So I try to be brief. So as part of my monastic life very early on, because I was a musician, everybody assumed that I could sing. This was not the case. If you know anything about the world of classical music, if you're instrumentalists, like singers are kind of, I don't know, they're somewhere over there, but you mainly don't talk to them, and they don't talk to you. And you certainly don't sing, which is a stupid and awful thing, because it's like, as a musician, I don't know, I think we should all be encouraged to sing. But anyway, that's another point. But everybody assumed that I could sing, so they would, at the beginning of the sitting meditation, they'd be like, oh, Phap Linh, go and chant, and we have a morning chant before the sitting meditation in the morning and the evening. But and of course I can hit the right notes, I can read the music, I can but I don't feel comfortable singing. And in fact, I feel a lot of shame and confusion. Are we connected?
Yeah, I think we're back.
Great.
We lost you just when you were talking about feeling shame.
Yeah.
In the morning chant.
Right. So I started noticing, because then, okay, so apply mindfulness, notice what's happening. Okay, I am treating this as a performance. I'm treating this as basically me being the best. I have to chant it better than anybody else. I have to do it really well. And I'm sort of expecting some praise afterwards. I'm kind of like, or at least I'm kind of waiting for it. Like somebody's, oh, that was a really good morning chant. Like I want to know how that's just unconsciously how I'm treating it all. So I've now noticed that. Well, okay, so this whole thing is making me quite tense, and the whole thing is quite unpleasant. So let me just reframe this whole experience. What's happening here is I have a room of 150 people. They could not care less about me right now and my chant. They're just waking up. It's like 6:30 and 6 in the morning. They're just trying to have a nice sitting meditation. They're just hoping not to fall asleep, and maybe hoping to have a little insight or to feel comfortable or to feel well. So I am in service to that, or I could be. So let me put myself, I'm not important. What's important here is all of these people. What do they want? What do they need? How can I support them? I am here as their servant, really, like to just, so then my love comes up. You see, then I'm like it's like my mother seed. I just want to love them. I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, it's tough. Maybe you're not used to sitting meditation. Maybe you get distracted. Maybe you fall asleep. Like, my wish for you is to have the most wonderful, peaceful, insightful sitting meditation you've ever had in your life. That's now all I'm thinking about. For these 150 people, it's like a prayer. So it's really like, talk about setting an intention, but it's literally like I would join my palms. I'd be sitting there in the dark, sitting at the bell. It's not a performance. Nobody can see me. I'm just like creating this intention. What I wish is for you, all of you, to have a wonderful, peaceful sitting meditation. And I only think about that. And then I start inviting the bell and I start chanting, and it all comes naturally and it's all very fluid. I'm not worried about it because I maintain my concentration throughout the whole chant on these people's experience, not mine. And I found every single time I managed to remember that, to reframe like what's even happening, who it's about, what it's for, everything works better. So recently we had a chance to work with a wonderful producer in Plum Village, and we didn't really know what was going to happen, but part of the idea was like, maybe we're going to record an album. But right at the beginning, some of us got together, and because I'd had this experience, I was really keen, and it turned out everybody was quite aligned on this, to set an intention. So we kind of invented a little ceremony. And, we have some ceremonies in Plum Village. And so I kind of looked up one in the chanting book, and there was one about like blessing a space, where there's a purification of the water ceremony, and then you sort of spread water around the room, and you call on the support of the ancestors. And there's a whole thing, there's certain chants, and it's, so I just thought, well, we are blessing a space. We're blessing this recording studio, and we're blessing each other, and we're all going to, and then I created within the context of that little ceremony an opportunity for everybody to share their intention, like what was important for them in this project. And it was very beautiful what everybody said. Like, I think some of the things I've said today are a little bit related. It's more like, for me, it was the importance of being able to record and make and create, write and sing, perform music for love, and to kind of touch an experience of love and maybe even healing in others, and just to feel like, okay, we're sending it out into the world only for that. And then the others shared different things, but all quite, very aligned actually. And I must say that for the next 3 weeks of this project, I felt we were protected by this vow, by this intention. It's real, it's a ceremony, which is, again, doesn't come easily for me, but very, very profound. It really, really, and I felt like about halfway through, some of us noticed we were starting to lose it. And there was a little bit of tension coming into the group, a little bit of disgruntlement and competition and weird energies. So we're like, oh, okay, we need to, bring because we'd started with 4 and now there was like 12 people. So it was like, oh, they didn't all do the ceremony. We should do another ceremony. So we just did another ceremony and everyone was like, oh yeah, that's what this is about. That's what we're doing. And it provides this kind of protection, just knowing like we are actually aligned at this very, very deep level. We know what we care about. We know what's important to us. Yeah. So that's, I think that's real. I think that's a very, very real thing. And maybe it's just like a stick of incense and then everybody shares an intention. Maybe there's a song that you can sing together. Maybe you can have a bell. It's like you have to kind of just conjure it up, but there's probably bits and pieces of other traditions and things that you can pull from to make it work. And if you want, there's a Plum Village, we have a chanting book. It's called Chanting from the Heart, and there's a ceremony in there. It's like dedication of of a new house or something. So that's the structure we followed. But I would recommend that you do something that's meaningful and sort of rooted for you.
Thank you, Phap Linh. Thank you for the question, Kelly.